Will I be hoovered? I haven't heard from him in a month. He's moved on, hasn't he? I exposed what she's like to all her family. She won't be contacting me again, that's for sure. I told him I know what he is, and he disappeared, so I doubt I'll hear from him again. He's with somebody else already, so I guess he won't want me again, will he? I told him what I thought of him, and he just backed off. He won't hoover me now, will he? He came crying back to me, and I gave him short shrift. I doubt he will bother me again. Wrong. One of the most common questions that I'm asked is, will I be hoovered? Those asking the question, 50% don't want it to happen, 50% do want it to happen, driven by emotional thinking, capitalizing on various empathic traits to cause them to want to get answers, to get even with the narcissist, to cause the narcissist woe, to even be able to demonstrate that the hoover can be rejected. All of those things amount to emotional thinking. Logic determines, once you realize that you're dealing with a narcissist, you impose no contact, and therefore no hoover should get through. There are many different scenarios and outcomes involving our kind where the victim considers that our kind will not bother with them again, post-disengagement or post-escape. The victim thinks that a period of total silence, the involvement of the narcissist with a new victim, the manner in which the relationship ended will all mean that the narcissist will never, ever come sniffing around the victim again, i.e., there will never be a hoover. But we will. Why is this? First of all, it is necessary to appreciate our perspective. The narcissistic perspective dictates that you belong to us. You are our appliance. You are our property. The formal relationship between us may have ended. We are no longer boyfriend and girlfriend. But the narcissistic relationship is forever. It only ends when either you or I cease to draw breath, and even then, there might be circumstances where we could hoover you from beyond the grave. I don't mean in a spiritual way, that we rise like some zombie, or that the apparent demonic possession that occurred when, according to some, a demonic spirit entered the anus of the narcissist aged 4, turning him into a demonically possessed being. No, there are ways that we could set up matters through post, through proxy, and through delayed electronic communication to hoover you from beyond the grave. But in general terms, hoovering ends when either you or I cease to draw breath. It doesn't matter that we enter into a new formal relationship with somebody else. It doesn't matter if you do. It doesn't matter that World War III erupted when we parted company. It doesn't matter if there has been complete silence for 2 years. None of these factors alter the fact that in our minds, lesser or mid-range in the unconscious mind, greater or ultra the conscious mind, that there is a connection between you and I because of the narcissistic relationship which lasts until one of us dies. What has happened is immaterial to that belief. Where it is material is appertaining to the potential level of risk that you will be hoovered. Some circumstances mean you're more likely to hoovered, some mean less, but this overall mindset that you belong to us is unaffected by anything. Secondly, of course, we need to assert control over you, and that is the main driver behind whether you might be hoovered. You come up on the radar, our narcissism essentially asks, is this person under control? And if they are not, we have to assert control over you. And the starting point, as I explained in the 3 assertions of control, is that we will assert control over you in a direct method, i.e. the hoover. Of course, there's also the need for fuel. This is an important driver with regard to hoovering you, although it doesn't always mean that we will do so. I'm repeatedly asked by people, will I be hoovered? And I always answer the same. There is always, repeat, always a risk that you will be hoovered, but you can do a lot to manage that risk. People set out the circumstances of the end of the former relationship to me and what has happened since, if anything, and ask, will I be hoovered? Or they express their view that they don't think it will happen because of A or B or C. My answer again is always the same. There is always a risk of us returning, but you can manage that risk. It's never the end. There is always a risk, a chance, a probability, or a possibility that we will return to you and apply a hoover. You cannot ever make the dangerous and complacent mistake of assuming it's over. No matter how much it may seem that it is over, no matter how much it may appear to you that we will not come back, that we apparently have no reason to do so, such assumptions are dangerous and are also wrong. There are only two factors which are material to the issue of whether you'll be hoovered again. The first factor is the Hoover trigger. For a hoover to happen, it must be triggered. This doesn't mean that you will be hoovered, it raises the possibility that you will be hoovered. For there to be a Hoover trigger, you have to come onto our radar. In effect, you come to our attention in some way. When this happens, it is because you have entered one of the 6 spheres of influence, and a separate video about the spheres of influence and what you can do about them is available. I won't repeat the content of that video other than to state that you have control over whether you enter any of the first 5 spheres of influence, and therefore if you have a total no-contact regime, you will not enter those first 5 spheres, thus reducing the possibilities of there being Hoover triggers drastically. However, you don't have any control over whether you enter the 6th sphere of influence. That can happen irrespective of your total no-contact regime, and that is why there always remains a risk of being hoovered, because we may just think about you, or we may be reminded of you by somebody or something, and there's nothing you can do about that. By staying away from us through a total no-contact regime, you avoid the first 5 spheres, thus reducing considerably the prospect of causing a Hoover trigger. The 6th sphere is when we happen to think of you or we are reminded of you. Accordingly, if you have successfully implemented your no-contact regime, the only risk that exists of a Hoover trigger being activated is if we happen to think about you or we are reminded of you. You can't do anything about that. Of course, if we've replaced you in the golden period, we are far less likely to think of you. And even if we are reminded of you, there are certain instances appertaining to the Hoover Execution Criteria that I have explained in a separate article about whether you'll be, essentially, does the narcissist think about you following your disengagement or escape? That means that you're unlikely to be hoovered. But in essence, if you enter one of the first 5 spheres, such as telephoning us, coming to see us, send us text messages, walking past where we live so that we see you, being seen across the square from where we work, then you'll cause a Hoover trigger, which means there is then a potential for you to be hoovered. You can work out yourself that if you keep entering the first 5 spheres and causing lots of Hoover triggers, you are increasing the risk of being hoovered. So first of all, there has to be this Hoover trigger. If you maintain no contact, then the first 5 spheres won't be entered. And then the only risk is if we happen to think of you or are reminded of you. And that may not happen for weeks or for months. You can therefore understand that by staying out of the first 5 spheres, you'll vastly reduce the risk of a Hoover trigger being activated. But you cannot state that it will never happen because of the existence of the 6th sphere. We move on to the second factor. So first of all, there has to be Hoover trigger. Then, the second aspect concerns the Hoover Execution Criteria. The best way to envisage this is like a set of scales, and there are certain factors which arise at the point of there being a Hoover trigger, and they will vary. So there's different weights available at different times to go on these scales. Some of these weights, some of the criterion, are such that they will mean that a Hoover is more likely, some mean it's less likely, and they're looked at in aggregate. Understand that when you're dealing with a lesser or mid-range narcissist, they are not consciously going through this list and then going, there's this, and this. Yes, I'll Hoover. This is what's going on in their unconscious. And this process is consciously evaluated by the greater or the ultra. So first of all, there must be a Hoover trigger. If there is, then it moves on to the Hoover Execution Criteria. The Hoover Execution Criteria contain matters such as where you stand within the fuel hierarchy, whether you can easily be located, how easy it is to contact you, can we walk round the corner to see you, can we ring you up, or do we have to get on a plane and fly to another continent to see you, how good your defences are, what support networks you have in place, are you with somebody else, have you a restraining order against you, what are our fuel levels like, what is our fuel matrix like, have you wounded us recently? And if so, how extensive was that wounding and how recent was the wounding, or has time passed? What school of narcissist are you dealing with? These are some of the factors, and there are others applicable also. And therefore, all of these matters basically come together in aggregate, and the narcissism decides whether it's worthwhile asserting control over you directly by hoovering you. In some instances, the criteria are easily met, thus you are hoovered. In other instances, the criteria is not met, so it's a red light, and the narcissist doesn't hoover you, so there's no direct assertion of control, and instead, the narcissist will assert control through the second or third assertions of control. So, when you come up on the radar, that is a Hoover trigger. The narcissism essentially asks, is this person under control? If the answer to that is no, then the narcissism goes to the first assertion of control and determines, is the stage set? Is the ground favourable to a Hoover? And in essence, evaluates so doing with regard to the Hoover Execution Criteria. Remember, narcissism is a self-defense mechanism, and therefore it's not going to cause the narcissist to hoover you if this is going to result in further wounding to the narcissist or a lack of success. And the ability of the narcissism to determine that, of course, is calibrated to the level of narcissist, the school of narcissist that you're dealing with. So a lower echelon narcissist, your lessers, and the lower mid-range, for instance, may still try and hoover in circumstances where it goes wrong. Middle mid-rangers, upper mid-rangers will show a bit more of a judicious response. Graders, of course, and the ultra, using calculation and awareness, will determine that it's not appropriate use of resource, that there is a risk of wounding, and therefore a different assertion of control might be utilised. If we're presented essentially with a sitting target that we know that's going to flow with fuel, that's caught in the emotional seas, isolated, that they haven't caused any wounding recently, that we can go and see very readily, there's no restraining order, that we can contact electronically, then you'll be hoovered. What you need to become is a flawed reason to extract emotion, also known as a free. If you do that through a strict and total no-contact regime, it's far less likely that you will be hoovered. So, if you do everything possible to become a free, then even when a Hoover trigger is activated, and there will always be one at some point, then the chances of the Hoover Execution Criteria being met are far less likely. And that means you're far less likely to be hoovered. And instead, the narcissist will have to assert control indirectly, for instance, smearing or triangulation, or by withdrawal. And with those second and third assertions of control, you are then far less likely to actually hear from the narcissist. Accordingly, understand when it comes to a Hoover, there has to be a Hoover trigger. You come up on the radar. And at that point, the narcissism asks, are you under control? If the answer is no, then it looks at asserting control over you directly, namely, can a Hoover be placed against you? And for that, the Hoover Execution Criteria has to be met. The narcissism evaluates that unconsciously with regard to less from mid-range narcissists, and if it ascertains that the circumstances are appropriate, then a Hoover is executed and tried against you. If the narcissism determines that it's not appropriate, then there will be no Hoover, there will be no direct assertion of control, and instead the narcissism has to assert control through the indirect or withdrawal methods instead. When you are asking yourself, therefore, will I be hoovered? Remember this. You can never say that you will never be hoovered. There needs to be a Hoover trigger. You can significantly influence whether there is one by staying out of the 5 spheres of influence, but you can never remove the risk of a Hoover trigger because of your presence in the 6th sphere. And thereafter, the Hoover Execution Criteria have to be met. Again, you can significantly influence whether that criteria is met through a total no-contact regime becoming a flawed reason to extract emotion, a free. And therefore, you can significantly reduce the risk, but you can never ever remove it. There is a lot that you can do by applying my work to establish a total no-contact regime, and thus reduce the risk of being hoovered. But understand, there is always a risk. If you think, I'll never be hoovered because I've massively wounded the narcissist, you're wrong. If you think, oh, I exposed him to everybody, he slunk away and he'll never be back, you're wrong. It doesn't mean that there's a guarantee that you'll be hoovered, but you must understand there's always a risk, and you must maintain a degree of vigilance in that regard, and that is by maintaining your no-contact regime. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.